Ephesians bonus video number 9, Submission, Women, Children, and Slaves First, Part 2. Now, as Christians, we live moral, ethical, spirit-controlled lives in front of all the non-Christians around us. And they are controlled instead of by the Spirit, but by evil desires. And so why do we do this? Well, Paul tells us in Ephesians 5:15. So we're very careful how we live, not as unwise, but as wise. Verse 16, making the most of every opportunity because the days are evil. And then as part of that, verse 21, Paul then said, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. You see, it was through humble, mutual submission where Christians stood out from their culture around them. When everyone else surrendered to their own desires and demands, they looked like Jesus and less like the world culture. There's probably no word that flies in the face of our American culture than the word submit. You see, our culture, it emphasizes personal gain, personal successes, and personal advancement, even at the expense of others. And so Paul, to explain this concept of mutual submission, this radical idea, he gave 3 examples. And those examples of submission were the relationship between a husband and a wife, a father and a child, and between masters and slaves. Now, long before Paul wrote this, the Greek philosopher Aristotle wrote about what he called household codes. These household codes were instructions on how a man, a husband, and a father lived a virtuous life, could be respected, and how he could have a well-ordered home. Virtue was seen in how this man treated his wife, his children, and his slaves. Now, that middle one, fathers and children, well, it's the least controversial. Children obeying parents, and parents, specifically fathers, treating their children well, that just makes sense. But the other two, marriage and slavery, well, those are a little more complex in our culture today. Now, in this video, we're going to talk maybe about the most difficult one for our modern culture, and that's slavery. The enslaving of another person is one of the most vile and deplorable things humans have done to each other. And as a 21st century American, I have to be honest with our own history. The systematic subjugation and enslavement of African peoples through the centuries was an evil abomination. Its impact is still felt today, not just Africans, but many cultures around the world. That word slavery, it still brings up horrific images in our mind. It invokes understandable emotions, and it should be responded to with a sense of shame and deep sorrow. But, as we know, slavery did not end with the Civil War. Today, slavery, or as we call it now, human trafficking, is just as disgusting, despicable, and present as in times past. And as we've seen, as we've cooperated and worked through ministries like Project Rescue, evil continues to rob dignity and subjugate the helpless. Slavery is evil. Which makes Paul's words here all the more confusing, because in verse 5 of chapter 6, Paul said, slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear, with sincerity of heart, just as you would obey Christ. Obey them, not only to win their favor with their eye is on you, but like slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from your heart. Serve wholeheartedly, as if you were serving the Lord, not men. Because you know that the Lord will reward everyone for whatever good he does, whether he's a slave or free. So, how can Paul, how can the Bible seemingly endorse so evil an institution as slavery? Why doesn't Paul call for the end of slavery? Why doesn't he inspire an uprising or an overthrow? Does Paul think slavery is okay? Well, to get to the answers to these questions, we're first going to look at what slavery was like for Jews in the Old Testament, specifically under the law. And then we'll also look at the Roman slave practices at the day that Paul wrote, as well as what the early church looked like. And then, after doing all that, we'll try to integrate these ideas into sort of an explanation, or at least try to attempt to understand what Paul's telling the Ephesians. Again, before I go any further, I have to say that my thinking on this has been heavily influenced by 2 books. The first is by Craig Keener, called Paul, Women, and Wives. He writes extensively on this subject and the Ephesians passage. The second book is The Patient Firmament of the Early Church. Now, I'll tell you, this is a hard book to read, filled with languages that most of you don't know. I don't know them, had to use a translation book alongside, but it's a collection of early church documents that addressed how real early Christians, including Christian slaves, were to live out the gospel among their oppressors. These were sermons that pastors and leaders preached to Christians who were slaves and told them how to flesh out the gospel. It is incredibly challenging. So thanks to Dr. Keener and Dr. Kreider and others who've shaped my thoughts. So let's get into it. How did God view slavery, and what does the Old Testament say? Well, the discussion of slavery in the Old Testament is difficult to read through our 21st century framework. Regardless of what I'm saying, at some point in this, you're going to respond with a little bit of frustration and a little bit of hesitancy, because even I do. However, when we step out of our 21st century context and into the framework, the context of the time that the Old Testament law was written, it's actually viewed, when through that lens, slavery in Old Testament law was downright radical. You see, Old Testament law viewed slaves as persons. Now, it also viewed them as property, which is what we react against. How can a person be property? Because slaves were people, but they were also bought and sold. However, it's very clear from our reading the Old Testament law that the law itself never diminished the humanity of a person who was a slave as other cultures did. It's also important to note that that term slave was used very loosely and defined in many different ways. A slave could have been someone who had been taken in battle and captured. Rather than killed on the battlefield, they were allowed to live and work. Someone who was being punished for a crime. They didn't have institutions for prisoners, so living out your criminal sentence could be that you were, instead of put in prison, you were placed as a slave. Some would call that more humane. It could be someone who was working off a debt, even someone who had, get this, voluntarily given up their freedom rights to then go work for someone else who would then provide for them. So it's clear, you can read in the book of Judges, also in Proverbs, that many slaves worked as household employees, and they worked, and the word is, with their masters. They didn't work for them necessarily, they worked alongside them. We actually see some of this probably in the book of Ruth as well. Slaves were instructed to follow Old Testament law. They were given the Sabbath off. Slaves were allowed to acquire and own property and possessions. Slaves could allowed to do things. Female slaves who had become concubines or were of their masters were to be treated as wives, no longer as slaves. If a master struck and killed a slave, the master was guilty of murder, and that was a capital offense. Jews were not to have other Jewish slaves, according to Leviticus. If a Jew voluntarily submitted himself to slavery, if it happened, the length of the slavery was 6 years. That's the most they could be enslaved. At the end of 6 years, the slave was released, according to Deuteronomy 15. This is not long-term, lifetime slavery. And at release, the person who was the master was required to give them food, provisions, and then help them start a new business and a new life. Yeah, you heard me right. If a person voluntarily became a slave, it could only last 6 years. Now, at the end of that time, because some people enjoyed that arrangement, there was an opportunity for that person to voluntarily commit to be a slave longer than this. Now, saying that, I know in our Western freedom-thinking mindset, for someone to voluntarily give themselves to slavery, it's unthinkable. Why would someone do this? Well, there are a lot of reasons. A poor person could give themselves to another household to work. In that sense, they were working, and then they were being provided for. Some who could not pay off debt could work their debt as a slave. It's enough at this point to say that Old Testament instructions on slavery were far different from the African slave trade of the 1600s to the 1800s. Granted, now these rules, they applied to Jewish slaves and not necessarily foreign slaves. But even with those foreign slaves, dignity and human value was embedded in the law code. This approach to slavery was more humane, more progressive than any of the other law codes from the surrounding empires at the time. Now, people are people. Nothing was perfect, and people themselves committed atrocities. But the Old Testament approach, the law, God's approach to slavery was far different than what we think of when we say slavery today. You could say that in many ways, Hebrew slaves were more like a long-term labor contract between an individual and a whole lot less like exploitation. And while not always true, that seems to be the intent of Jewish law. Craig Keener talks about it this way: God's instructions on slavery were a concession to a fallen world, not his desire that should be accomplished. Jewish slaves were property, but they had dignity, must be treated fairly, had legal rights, and they were released after a certain period of time. Now, all of this would have influenced Paul, who was a student of the Old Testament law, his understanding of both human dignity and the institution of slavery. But Paul was writing to the Ephesians, who there were Jews there, but most of them were Greek or Roman. They were under Roman rule. What did Roman slavery look like? It was completely different than Jewish thinking. Roman culture viewed slavery very different. It's been suggested that somewhere between a third to half of all the people in the Roman Empire were actually slaves. And then only a small percentage of free families actually owned those slaves. The owning of slaves was an expensive economic situation. Slaves of the Roman Empire were typically people who had been conquered in war. They were also guilty of crimes or were children who had been sold by their parents. Yeah, you heard that. Parents who were poor would sell their children into slavery. And then there was generational slavery of people who were born slaves. Most slaves in the Roman Empire were trapped in this lifestyle. But in some of the more affluent areas, skilled slaves could seek their freedom. There are accounts of Roman slaves who themselves became rich. Yeah, slaves became rich. Some in Roman homes that were better off than that lived there, that they were better off than the poor free peasants that lived outside of home. So slaves were treated better and had a better lifestyle than those who were free. Now, it's these individuals that Paul most likely addresses in Ephesians 6. It's most likely that these slaves worked for middle to affluent homes. They were educated, they were taken care of, and possibly even, get this, the slave was possibly even compensated for some of their work. We know this: they had enough freedom to practice their religion that they could come and go to places of worship and participate in religious services. Different, though, from Jewish views of slavery, Roman and Greek philosophers devalued the humanity of slaves. Aristotle famously believed that some people were inferior by nature and should be ruled. They were, as his words, living tools to be used by their betters, as they were different in their essence. Slaves were not allowed typically to legally marry. Slave children could be taken away from their parents. Sounds very similar to American Western slavery of the last several centuries. So what about our church? What about the Ephesian church? As I've already said, it's clear these Ephesian Christians were slaves, but it's also clear that some of them had actually become masters who had then become Christians. There were slaves and there were masters worshiping Jesus together. And Paul, in a beautifully, powerfully anointed way, leveled the playing field of all dignity, humanity, and status for everyone in the room. Ignoring social norms, the Bible declared that all men were equal, Jew and Gentile, male and female, slave and free. Slaves who carried the Spirit of God inside them would become leaders in the church. Former slaves would become bishops and elders. Some of the first leaders of the church, the popes, had been slaves at one time. The Bible and church history shows that church funds were actually used to free slaves, and that records that some Christians became slaves voluntarily to ransom sick and weaker Christians who themselves were slaves. They replaced them because they could live while the weak Christians couldn't. Early church leaders like Tertullian and Ignatius, they instructed Christian slaves to model godliness and Christ-likeness to their masters. Most telling is when you go to the tombs of early Christians, slaves and free people were buried together with no distinction. Over time, the spiritual equality and the raising of dignity that Paul seated and Scripture called for took root. Eventually, Christian leaders like John Chrysostom in the 5th century preached and called for Christians to use their own money to buy slaves, then train and empower those slaves to make a living, and then set them free. So how do we understand Paul in Ephesians 6? Because Paul addressed the relationship between slaves and masters, but he did it without attacking or even seemingly addressing the institution of slavery itself. And in not doing this, Paul leaves many people frustrated. So why wouldn't he do it? Well, Paul Paul wasn't focused at this point on changing the bigger picture of societal evils because he and the church he wrote to, they were simply not in a position to change these institutions. Christians were a minority sect in the Roman Empire, a very small minority sect, and they had little to no influence to make the change. The first century world was not a modern society, and rebels were violently put down. But I do believe Paul did consider slavery immoral, and he believed human dignity was inherent in human creation. But at least here in Ephesians, he's hesitant to call for societal overthrow. But Paul's revolutionary subversion of society's corrupt ways were not stymied. While not calling for violent protest in the street, Paul did call for a spiritual overthrow of evil. Craig Keener said it this way: Paul, a pastor and a missionary, was out to change the world by starting where he realistically and reasonably could, by spreading Christianity and demanding that all Christians love and respect one another as themselves. Absent the tools of democratic reform, Paul did not create change through protest. He did not change through voting or politics. He started somewhere else: the human heart, the spiritual condition of all humans. You see, evil is and was a spiritual condition. Slavery was a byproduct of evil and corrupt society. Lasting change would only come when the majority population was transformed by the gospel of Jesus Christ. And that transformation would only come when Christians, both slaves and masters, made the most of every opportunity to share the gospel. It was through radical, righteous living that this would be accomplished. In Paul's writings, in light of what Roman culture believed in slavery, were progressive and subversive. Paul even writes to Philemon about a runaway slave, Onesimus. He tells the owner, Philemon, release him from slavery and forgive him. Paul declared more than once that in Christ there was no longer slave nor free. Paul was a pastor. His letter was pastoral. He gave instructions for his fellow Christians who were both slaves and slave owners how to live out mutual submission, even in a context of the household codes and norms of their day. His instructions, they don't make the Ephesian setting valid for all time, but it's for Christ-likeness. And just those people who've used these passages to justify slavery, especially in the 19th and 18th century among Western Christianity, misuse this passage. They misuse these verses because this was not universal. This was instructions for Ephesian setting on how to live like Christ. Let me say it this way. Paul did not endorse or validate slavery. He did endorse and validate Christ-likeness in any setting. In Paul's view of authority and submission, well, they're difficult to understand outside the context they were written in. We see the same thing in Romans 13 when Paul instructs believers to submit to the authority of the government. That submission also to authority is nuanced and has to be fleshed out in each sort of cultural expression. And now, let's one more time go back through our passage before we end. Verse 5, slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear and with sincerity of heart, just as you would obey Christ. Verse 6, obey them not only to win their favor when their eye is on you, but like slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from your heart. Paul's words to the slaves: live with respect and honor your situation as slaves to God first, slaves to masters second. It is in living wisely and respectfully you win their favor, and in winning their favor you will win them to the Lord. Now, that's hard for our modern ears to hear, but this is exactly what happened in history. It was the respectful, holy living of slaves, particularly slave women, that enabled them to share the gospel with their masters and ultimately led to Christianity spreading through the empire. There are stories of Christian women who, through the birthing process and watching their children taken from them because they were slaves, ultimately led their Roman and Greek owners to Christ. How they treated them when they were robbed of their children, when they responded with humility, with grace, with even submission. They saw something different in these early Christians, and they wanted to know about their Christ. Paul's instructions were ones he followed himself, not as a slave, but as a prisoner. In submitting himself to the authority as a prisoner, he was able to share the gospel throughout Rome. And Paul continued, verse 7, serve wholeheartedly, as if you were serving the Lord, not men, because you know that the Lord will reward everyone for whatever good he does, whether he is slave or free. And in that one verse, Paul just blew up the culture of his day. God rewards the slave and the free the same. Aristotle would be livid. Racists would be mad. Because Paul says it was not social order that determined reward, but obedience, no matter what position in the order you were in. Some people were not less than others, and some were not better. All were equal. But then Paul complicates it, because then he says, and masters, treat your slaves in the same way. Do not threaten them, since you know that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and there will be no favoritism with him. Now, most of you will probably bought the argument that slaves should win their masters, but here Paul indicates that there were slave owners in the church as well, and yes, Paul does this. Why? Well, we'll get to it in a second, but for now, don't miss the last part of verse 9. There is no favoritism with God. Masters are not better than slaves. Slaves are not better than masters. God rewards the good in us whether we are slave or free. Here we see the same glimmer of mutual submission in reference to husbands and wives. Slaves and masters are to treat each other the same. Slaves, verse 5, live with honor and respect. Masters, verse 9, treat your slaves the same way, with honor and respect. This was unheard of revolutionary language. Masters, respect your slaves. I'm not a huge expert, but I'm unaware of any other contemporary in the ancient world who called for this same kind of equality between master and slave. I think it's fair to say Paul's view of slavery was vastly different from the rest of the people in this time period. So how can Paul not call for the end of slavery? How could he give instructions to masters? Why didn't he say, you just set everybody free? I think it's because as a minority group, Christians lacked the ability to make that kind of change that was needed. The issue was a heart issue, was a values issue. And again, I'll go to Craig Keener, who summarized it this way. He said, Paul is addressing the authority structures of his day, not mandating the same authority structures for all periods. Paul does call on us to submit to those in authority, though he qualifies that authority by summoning those in authority to respect those under them as equals. This is hardly the same as giving unqualified license to those in authority or saying that we must submit to the same structures in the same way as people did in the Greco-Roman world, simply because that was the culture in which Paul happened to dictate his letter. The earliest church was powerless to abolish slavery and to invert the social structure of its day, except by treating one another as equals and serving one another in their own homes. But the radical conception of self-sacrificial service was the seed that was bound to lead to abolitionism and other protests against human oppression. You might think about it this way. Paul was in the long game of changing society rather than the short game of changing Ephesus. So in conclusion, Paul used marriage, parenting, and slavery to illustrate how all Christians should mutually submit to each other in radical differentiation from the world around it. Wives should submit to husbands. Husbands should submit to wives. Children should submit to fathers. Fathers should submit to children. And yes, slaves should submit to masters, and masters should submit to slaves. And it was in raising the value of human beings to equality that lasting change could take place. Because together, in Christ, we are all one.